all my railings against the Platonists, it's hard to ignore the transcendent nature of mathematical truths. There is nothing else that all men are compelled to agree upon. And when the last light in the last eye fades to black and takes all speculation with it forever, I think it could even be that these truths will glow for just a moment in the final light. And then the dark and the cold will claim everything.
Patient is a 20-year-old Jewish Caucasian female, attractive, possibly anorexic. Arrived at this facility 6 days ago, apparently by bus and without luggage. Admission signed by Dr. Wagner. Patient had a plastic bag full of $100 bills in her purse, something over $40,000, which she attempted to give to the receptionist. Patient is a doctoral candidate in mathematics at the University of Chicago and has been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic with a long-standing etiology of visual and auditory hallucinations. Resident of this facility on 2 prior occasions.
My father came in and found me there, and I thought I was in trouble, and I jumped up, but he took me by the hand and led me back to the chair and sat me down and went over the paper with me. His explanations were clear, simple, but it was more than that. They were filled with metaphor. He drew a couple of Feynman diagrams, and I thought they were pretty cool. They mapped the world of the subatomic particles he was attempting to explain. The collisions, the weighted routes. I understood, really understood, that the equations were not a supposition of the form whose life was confined to the symbols on the page which described them, but that they were there, before my eyes, in actuality. They were in the paper, the ink, in me, the universe. Their invisibility could never speak against them or their being, their age, which was the age of reality itself, which was itself invisible and always had been. He never let go of my hand.
The actual issue is that someone 100,000 years ago sat up in their robes and said, "Holy shit." Something like that. He didn't have a language yet, but what he had just understood is that one thing can be another thing. Not look like it or act upon it, be it, stand for it. Pebbles can be goats, sounds can be things. The name for water is water. What seems inconsequential to us by reason of usage is in fact the founding notion of civilization. Language, art, mathematics, everything. Ultimately, the world itself and all in it.
Do you think that the world exists?
No.
You're not serious.
Let's just say that I don't understand the question. It's like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. What it fails to address is that the ability of a quantum event to eventuate, without any help from us, is a very different thing from an observation of the event. What bridges the worlds of the event and the witness? It may take an observer to complete the picture of the event, not to mention the need for apparati with timers and Stern-Gerlach magnets, but not of the event itself, the engendering of it.
I'm not sure I get that.
It just seemed a useful analogy. It's just that questions about the reality of things tend to be poorly formulated, and vague answers are as likely to reflect the quality of the question as that of the answer.
Why is it called mechanics?
Because it explains mechanisms, how things work. Quantum mechanics is just the theory of things the size of an atom or smaller. We think. We don't really know how small gets. Even h-bar as a scale invariant of the world is a supposition. People think a lot of this will be sorted out once we get a theory of quantum gravity, but they're looking through the wrong end of the glass. There will never be a theory of quantum gravity until there's a better theory of the universe. It's probably true that quantum mechanics has never been asked a quantum mechanical question that it couldn't answer. But if that were true of some domain of mathematics, you'd start sniffing around for tautologies. Heisenberg doesn't get the credit he deserves because he seems to have been a Nazi sympathizer, and then he went crazy, as if he were a mathematician. He and Pauli were just kids. All they had to go on were some anomalies in the spectra. They used to write letters to each other, and at one point, Pauli said that he was constantly amazed at the boldness with which Heisenberg approached these problems, and that he could only attribute it to Heisenberg's almost complete lack of understanding of physics. And of course, Pauli was right. And of course, he knew a great deal more physics than Heisenberg. But Heisenberg had what Einstein had, an almost faultless intuition as to the nature of physical reality, how things work, mechanisms.
You grew up in Los Alamos,
Yes, we lived there till my mother died.
and then you moved to Tennessee.
Yes,
Do you remember Los Alamos?
yes, of course.
How old were you when you left?
4, the first time, then 11.
4.
Yes.
What was it like?
During the war, I think it was pretty primitive. Supposedly, there were 8,000 fire extinguishers and 5 bathtubs, and endless mud. What I remember mostly is people at our house talking until 3 o'clock in the morning.
You were awake until 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yes, you could hear the clink of glasses. The house smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke. I would lie there listening until the last guest had left.
You couldn't have understood what they were talking about.
What I understood was that I had to learn what they were talking about.
Where is Trinity? Is that in Nevada?
New Mexico.
Was your father there?
Yes, of course.
Did he talk about it?
Not much. I've read the standard accounts. My father's group was about 6 miles from ground zero. They'd been given glasses that were very dark. I think something like welding goggles. But my father had brought his own because he didn't think you'd be able to see much with the government-issued glasses. I guess you can read that as a metaphor. But all the glasses had to do was block the ultraviolet light. They listened to the countdown over a loudspeaker. They were a pretty nervous lot. Not that it would go off, but that it wouldn't. The thing I remember my father saying was that he put his hands over his goggles against the initial flare of light, and that when it came, he could see the bones in his fingers with his eyes closed. There was no sound, just this searing white light, and then the reddish-purple cloud rising in billows and flowering into the iconic white mushroom, symbol of the age. The whole thing standing slowly to 10,000 feet. The wind from the shockwave was supersonic, and it hurt your ears for just a moment. And lastly, of course, the sound of it. The ungodly detonation, followed by the slow rumble. The afterclap that rolled away over the burning countryside into a world that had never existed before. This side of the sun. The desert creatures evaporating without a cry. The desert birds incinerating and falling in slow arcs earthward, like burning party favors. And the scientists watching with this thing standing, twinned in the black lenses of their goggles. And my father watching it through his fingers, like, see no evil. But if they do nothing else, they all knew it was too late for that.
What did they say, the scientists?
They all stood up and said, "Holy shit." Intelligence is numbers. It's not words. Words are things we've made up. Mathematics is the world. The math and logic questions on the IQ tests are a joke.
How did it get that way? Intelligence is numerical.
Maybe it always was. Or you could say that we got there by counting. For 1,000,000 years before the first word was ever said. If you want an IQ of over 150, you'd better be good with numbers.
I would think it would be difficult for someone to assemble the responses which you did on some of these tests without being familiar with the test?
I'd had a certain amount of practice. I had to make A's in the humanities in college without reading the idiotic material assigned.
You wouldn't read the material on principle?
No, I just didn't have time.
Why didn't you have time?
Because I was doing math 18 hours a day.
You no longer do math.
No. Well, maybe on the problem of problems, which won't go away.
Which is?
The foundational problem. What to do about Frege, the Grundlagen, the unification question, the beginning and the end. What are we doing and how do we know? An insight. Does something know? Is that possible? And if it does, what must we become in order for it to tell us? The Langlands Project, which is not ever going to tell me what I want to know.
I see.
I don't think so. Mathematics is ultimately a faith-based initiative, and faith is an uncertain business.
I'm not sure I understand the idea of mathematics as what, a spiritual undertaking?
I know. I just don't have something else to call it. I've thought for a long time that the basic truths of mathematics must transcend number. It is, after all, a rather ramshackle affair, for all its considerable beauty. The laws of mathematics supposedly derive from the rules of logic, but there is no argument for the rules of logic that does not presuppose them. I suppose one thing that might evoke the analogy with the spiritual is the understanding that the greatest spiritual insights seem to derive from the testimonies of those who stand teetering in the dark.
And I don't see how mathematical truths could transcend number.
I know.
But you're nevertheless a fan of Gödel, even if he was a Platonist.
Yes, huge fan. I agree with Oppenheimer's view.
Are most of your heroes mathematicians?
Yes, or heroines.
Who else do you admire?
Cantor, Gauss, Riemann, Euler, Hilbert, Poincaré, Emmy Noether, the Ancients, Hypatia, Klein, Minkowski, Turing, von Neumann. That's not even a partial list. Cauchy, Lee, Dedekind, Brewer, Boole, Pino. Church is still alive. Hamilton, Laplace, Lagrange. You look at these names and the work they represent, and you realize that the annals of latter-day literature and philosophy, by comparison, are barren beyond description.
Beauty in mathematics?
Yes.
Is that a part of its description? Is that what makes it true?
Profound equations are often said to be beautiful. Maxwell, I suppose, most famously.
Are the equations themselves beautiful?
Not if you don't know what they mean.
All right. I don't know that much about Gödel. I know that he had a famous theory that mathematics couldn't solve all the questions it posed, or something like that.
Something like that, yes. 2 papers in 1931.
Is that a theory you agree with?
Of course. The papers are brilliant. They're beyond argument. I said that mathematical Platonism was incoherent, but that's not quite right. The truth is that there's nothing to cohere. The theory is simply barren. In his later years, Gödel drifted away from mathematics and studied philosophy. Then he went crazy.
How crazy?
Pretty bad. He wouldn't eat. Thought the food was poisoned. When he died, he weighed about 70 pounds. Oppenheimer was head of IAS at the time, and he would go to see him in the hospital. One day the doctor came in, and Oppenheimer told him to take good care of Gödel, because he was the greatest logician since Aristotle. And the doctor nodded and began to edge toward the door, and Oppenheimer realized that he was thinking, good God, now there's 2 of them.
So you took this Amati violin home on the bus?
Yes. When I got home, I sat down on the bed with it in my lap and opened the case. Nothing smells like a 400-year-old violin. I plucked the strings, and it was surprisingly close. I took it out of the case and sat there and tuned it. Ebony pegs. I wondered where the Italians had gotten ebony wood. And the fretboard, of course. I got out the bow. It was German-made, 18th century. Very nice ivory inlays. I tightened it, and then I just sat there and started playing Bach's Chaconne. Such a raw, haunting piece. He'd composed it for his wife, Barbara. She died while he was away, but I couldn't finish it.
Why not?
Because I started crying. I started crying and I couldn't stop.
Why were you crying? Why are you crying now?
I'm sorry. For more reasons than I could tell you. I remember blotting the tears off the spruce top of the Amati and laying it aside and going into the bathroom to splash water on my face. But it just started again. I kept thinking of the lines, "What a piece of work is a man." I couldn't stop crying. And I remember saying, "What are we? What are we?" And sitting there on the bed, holding the Amati, which was so beautiful it hardly seemed real. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and I couldn't understand how such a thing could even be possible.
Do you want to stop?
Yes.